This month's keynote is the capital strategist for Business Oregon and the director of the Oregon Growth Board. Here to talk to you today about how the state of Oregon is fostering entrepreneurship and innovation is Nate Wildfire. Nate? He's way back there. Come on up, Nate.
I stand in the back because I'm pretty tall. Does this podium move? Oh, it's really heavy. Wow. That was the heaviest podium I've ever lifted. All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much to EDCO for having me and giving me the chance to talk about the state's programs. This is what a millennial bureaucrat looks like these days. About 2 weeks ago, my hair was down to here and I had a full beard. So I don't know if that's it might be more Eugene than Ben, so I cleaned up a little bit. This is the extent of my cleaning. All right, quick poll. Who here has utilized a program supported by Business Oregon? Okay, about 15-ish of you. All right, we're going to do a couple more polls. You ready? Who here has been to the High Desert Museum? Okay. Did you know that the High Desert Museum gets support from the Oregon Cultural Trust, one of the many misfit toys of Business Oregon? And we support arts organizations that are major employers all over the state. Okay, question 2. Anybody here ever had Boneyard beer? Okay, that's more than 15. All right, Boneyard beer. I got a loan guarantee in 2013 from Business Oregon to do an expansion. Question number 3, who here has Facebook? Okay, did you know that the data center in Prineville is where all the photos you never look at are stored? True story. And we've provided many infrastructure programs to help the data centers all over the state be built. Business Oregon is your state's economic development agency. We call it Business Oregon to be a bit confusing. But we are a government agency. And we do many things in addition to the stuff I just said. We also work with minority and underrepresented entrepreneurs to get them help to access government contracts. We do cool stuff, very cool stuff, like be a conduit for federal funding. I know it's very exciting. Like CDBG, Community Development Block Grants, that have helped many different communities in Central Oregon. We also make direct loans to many, many businesses all throughout the state. Of course, we don't really have a purpose without all the business people, business owners, entrepreneurs, and folks that actually make our economy go. We are just, again, sometimes millennial bureaucrats. We're all ages. But really, that's the thing. Our purpose is to help drive business economy throughout the state forward. And all of you folks do that. Okay, a couple more questions. Who here has been to the Bend Venture Conference? All right, so this year, Business Oregon was one of the major limited partners and equity investors in the Bend Venture Conference. We were also a sponsor. And we create loan deal flow by partnering with BVC, which honestly is pretty awesome. Thanks, Brian. Number 2, who here knows about Julie Harrelson and Cascade Angels, Robert Pease, too? Where's he at back there? Yeah? Only a couple of you? She was just here. Come on. Julie and Cascade Angels, we are a direct investor in Cascade Angels. I think one of the larger LPs, right? Yeah? Anybody know who Seven Peaks is? Yeah? Okay. I think we might be one of the largest, or the largest limited partner in Seven Peaks Ventures as well. All right. So who here has benefited or utilized things supported by Business Oregon? Oh, you bunch of liars. Come on. All right. So the gist of this is we do a lot, and we're not particularly great at telling our story. So I'm very thankful to EDCO and the other folks here to get the chance to tell you just a little bit about it. Thank you very much. My job at Business Oregon is within the innovation and entrepreneurship team. So all that stuff I told you about, I don't have a whole lot to do with it, other than the investing part. But we try to drive innovation through a couple key ways, okay? So number one, I manage what's known as the Oregon Growth Board. This is a bunch of people that's appointed by the governor, and since the late 1990s, they make investments in loan funds, venture capital funds, angel conferences like BVC, equity funds, and the purpose is twofold. By the way, all the money comes from lottery dollars, so make sure you play the slots tonight on your way home. That helps pay my salary. Thank you. But we generate, number one, income for the state by making investments that pay off. So thank you to all the BVC investors and Cascade Angels investors and Seven Peaks investors in the room. We're partners with you in generating dollars back to the state. And then number two, since the late 90s, legislators basically said, you know what, we invest billions of dollars all over the world. Sometimes they're in funds in Europe, sometimes they're in Silicon Valley, sometimes they're in New York. Why aren't we doing more of that here in Oregon? And so they created this thing called the Oregon Growth Board to actually help birth venture capital funds, equity funds, angel funds, to actually see if that would work. And lo and behold, of course, it has worked, and it's worked pretty spectacularly. The venture capital funding in Oregon has, it still is, you know, low relative to Silicon Valley, but so is the rest of the world. But it has skyrocketed in the last decade. Number two, they said, geez, you know, it would be kind of cool if we actually invested in some venture capital funds outside the state and lured them here to actually open up a presence in Oregon or to start looking at Oregon companies. And so we've been pretty successful in doing that too, to get actual dollars from New York, North Carolina, Montreal, wherever, to come to invest in Oregon companies and drive innovation. That's across a lot of different sectors. Tech gets a lot of the attention because it's pretty liquid, right? Low, you know, pretty fast returns in comparison to other places. But we invest in natural resources. So we invest in forest land and farmland all over the state. We invest in advanced manufacturing, a lot of that coming out of the different educational facilities across Oregon. Of course, we invest in consumer goods. We're trying to get better at that, like dog treats, you know, maybe, right? Right, okay. Heads up, I don't invest in companies, just venture funds, but you know, we'll get to that in the end. And so what we've been able to do is actually try to pull capital from across the world to Oregon, and I think in a certain way, a little bit more importantly, help serve as a validator of different strategies, whether that's a venture fund or an angel conference or something else. Sometimes a lot of people look and they say, wow, the state's investing in that, it must be legit. We're going to do that too, because like our existential crisis isn't necessarily losing dollars. It's like ending up on the front page of the Willamette Week or, you know, Bend Bulletin, right? So we have to be pretty thoughtful and methodical and quite frankly risk averse when we're doing this, even though innovation has a lot of risk to it. So we do those things. That's what the Oregon Growth Board does. That's the thing I run. We have two pots of money, and in an effort to not bore you to death, one's really big and it's got really high standards, and the other one is very much built to launch new things or small things or things that don't have as big of a track record or maybe not hyper professional management. And I don't mean it's professional as like as a judgment, just literally there's nobody watching it full time. there's a difference there. So we have these two pots of money, and those two things do different things. We also have other innovation programs, right? So one of the speakers earlier said they had just applied to Business Oregon for an SBIR match. Are they still here? Yeah, so I mean, I don't know a whole lot about that, but you can come talk to me afterward. I'll give you an update. But we try as best as we can to provide non-dilutive early stage funding for businesses in startup mode. So sometimes that's an SBIR match, right? So someone goes out and they get a federal grant. Usually it's somewhat science and research based, but there's a lot of costs to driving a business when you're just early, right? You can't get a loan yet, maybe, or maybe not the loan you want. It's hard to get investors, and you're kind of taking your eye off the ball when you're trying to drum up an investor. So sometimes it's really, really helpful to get that grant to do the next product test, to buy the piece of equipment, to keep the lights on, to pay an attorney. And so we have competitive grant programs to do that. Another one we have right now, it's not affiliated with SBIR. Has anybody in here applied for the Enhanced Phase 0 grant? Okay, good. That's the one I manage. All right, there's people in the other room, but they're drinking beer. So that's another grant program, and basically you don't have to be going through an SBIR program, but the point again is, are you building something that's science and research related? Do you need that extra jump of cash to get over this hurdle? And so honestly, the last 2 months have been pretty eye-opening for me. I'm very accustomed to evaluating venture funds and angel conferences and debt funds, and for the last 2 months I've been learning about crazy nanoscience for materials that are, there are a lot of words I don't always understand, polymers, and if anybody here knows science, you know way more than me. But I have 15 science people on my committee that do know about it. I'm just the herder of cats. But we do things like, there's applications for things like horse Gatorade. There's applications for women's health medication. There's applications in there for things like a new binder for wood panels made for structural timber building, right? So cross-laminated timber, but it's for the polymer that holds the binding together. So it's it gets deep in a hurry, and it's been honestly pretty fascinating. We also do some pretty cool stuff with innovation that tries to drive industries forward. So for the last decade, we've been the biggest funder of Oregon Best, which is now Virtue Lab, ONAMI, which is affiliated with Oregon State University. That's Advanced Material Sciences. RAIN, which covers the Willamette Valley. This is an accelerator in Corvallis and Eugene, as well as a thing called OTRADI. They're all acronyms, sorry about that. But OTRADI's the bioscience incubator affiliated with OHSU. So we're the primary funder of almost all these things to try to spur innovation and companies to grow, basically from the ground up, birthed out of science oftentimes, but other places too. And then the last thing I'll say before I get to a closer here, we have launched in the last 24 months a rural opportunity initiative, and we like I think most of you intuitively understand that capital and education and talent and just literally humans are concentrated in population centers. And yet, innovation happens everywhere, including very rural places. And they need a bit of a different strategy sometimes. And quite frankly, we, as the state, aren't always the best at knowing what that strategy is. And so we are trying very deliberately to create funding for rural places to craft their own strategy and to educate us and say what works in your community, what works in your region. If you're in far eastern Oregon, it's going to be something totally different than Klamath Falls, and it's something totally different than Coos Bay or Astoria. And so we really rely on those communities to essentially teach us and say, this is what we need, this is what works here. Hey, state of Oregon, can you help? And so then we come in with different grant resources and technical assistance to try to build that there. Okay, so here's my closer. I've lived in Oregon now for 3 years. I am a Pittsburgher, so if you don't like the Steelers or Penguins, we can have words later. But I've been blown away by my new state, your state. In an hour and a half, I can be at the ocean. In an hour and a half, I can be on an 11,000-foot high volcano. In 2 hours, I can be in the desert. In a half hour, me and my wife can be in wine country, which is pretty great. I can go to the gorge. There's so many different locales here that are both geographic and cultural and different economic development strengths. And since that's kind of what I look for, my career started in community development. So how do I make a really urban, ultra-urban neighborhood in Pittsburgh a better place to live, work, and play? And then I went to Vermont for a while, and I did the same thing in a radically different place along the shores of Lake Champlain. And then I went to New Orleans for a little bit, and now I'm here. And those are pretty radically different places. And I gotta tell you, I'm in love with my new state. So I'm learning a lot, and my hope is that as Business Oregon, as your state's economic development agency, I never stop learning, because the businesses are what's inspiring me, and so I'm trying to build that sense of community in what we do, which I had in my previous jobs, and it's a little harder to do that when I work for people from Joseph all the way down to Enterprise. Well, they're not actually right next to each other, but all the way down to Ontario or Boardman or Lake Oswego, right? So I'll close by saying thank you to Bend, which has more fire than I've ever seen anywhere else, and my name's Wildfire, so I like that. And has always been welcoming to me and Business Oregon. So I really appreciate the chance to tell you a little bit about what we do to drive innovation. Thanks.
Thanks, Nate. Nice job. So, questions for Nate?
Nobody wants to ask government questions. It's okay.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Talina. How much money do you direct?
The Oregon Growth Board typically invests around $25 million a year. And then I guess I do another. The Oregon Innovation Council, which is a word I haven't said to you yet, that's a lot of those commercialization grants, and that's another 15-ish million a year. Yeah.
Yes. What are the mechanisms by which you're working with these rural areas?
So they're all different, and I don't work on that. So I'm gonna give you the 10,000-foot high level. But so they're all different. So for instance, in Baker City, they wanted to do essentially an incubator space, a co-working space, which they had not had before. And so they built one of those in the effort to populate that with a big need for them was collaborative office space. That it just didn't exist. And so they were trying to do that there. Klamath Falls was very different. It was how do we get these very disparate economic development agencies, whether that's SBDC or the community college or the county, how do you get them to work together instead of necessarily compete for both resources and clients? And so it was a lot more about strategic planning there, for instance. I think we just had another 10 winners, grant winners of these competitive grants, and so they're all different. They're all different throughout the state. If you want, I'll give you a card later and I can follow up with a much better answer.
Yes, Kim. What do you see as the next big thing?
Okay. Well, I'm going to make this up a little bit because I have a bunch. So one of the things that is becoming ever increasingly clear is that technology is becoming a part of most businesses in some way. So we had an instinct about a year ago when we released a grant program to say this isn't about software, it's not about apps because the venture capital community has developed to a place where there's actually a lot of options for competitive businesses, right? And like within a day, I had 19 different technical assistance providers like screaming at me. And they were like, you don't understand. If we're bioscience, we're also technology. If we're advanced manufacturing, we definitely have a web presence. If we're a consumer good, you better bet we have apps and app developers and engineers in our house. And so that's not the next big thing, but it's been a big reality for us as a government to grapple with, is that so many things that drive our economy now are tech-enabled. So that those lines aren't as clear anymore as they used to be. And then I would say a second one is there's a really strong appetite out there among what I'll call our largest businesses, like so our Nikes, our Intels, our our PGEs, like big things, to collaborate a little bit more with government. And because just like us, they're giant battleships that turn really slowly. And what they want is a lot of them to come together and maybe with us to say, we're going to invest in a bunch of far out, leading edge technology, science, research, whatever the next innovation is that might literally be 10 years. We always say it's 10 years out, but it ends up being 4. How do we be a better partner with those larger industries to actually drive entrepreneurs, right? Like the 1, 2, 5 people companies that are eventually going to have a huge impact on what a Nike does, what an Intel does. I think there's a huge appetite for that, and I see that coming. Yeah.
Yes, Aaron. Why does Ben have so much fire?
I mean, like I would like to know that answer. So my wife and I love coming here for like little vacations, and so, anywhere you go for brunch, there's a fire outside while you wait for your table. Anywhere, like literally anywhere. We went to the Safeway. There was a fire in Safeway. We arrived, and I'm sorry, I don't know the name. The little plaza right on the Deschutes there. There was like 8 fires. Like where I grew up, if I was standing like this close to a fire, there'd be 8 firefighters around me. And here, you're like, hey, 3-year-old, go get your face in there, and it's just a different ethos, and I love it. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I will opine on it for hours.
I didn't realize when you said that you meant actual fire. I thought you meant like fire, for entrepreneurialism.
Oh, no, you guys are pretty cool too, but I'm talking about conflagration.
Conflagration, okay.
Yeah.
One more question? Yes, Muriel. Can you explain the distinction between the Innovation Council and Business Oregon?
Yeah, so Business Oregon has many different boards and commissions and councils. Most of them, but not all, are appointed by the governor or the legislature in some way. So the Innovation Council is one of those things. It's one of the creatures of Business Oregon, just like the Oregon Growth Board. And so they both direct different pots of money. They both have different functions, that kind of stuff. The Oregon Growth Board is mostly populated by people that would have investment experience, whether that's debt or equity or VC or whatever. The Oregon Innovation Council is really populated by people who try to drive innovation. So it's a lot of tech transfer offices, a lot of accelerators, a lot of that sort of thing, yeah.
One more.
Big finish.
Big finish.
Oh, I don't know, but it's that cool.
I'll make it cool.
No, I know you would. This is why I'm asking.
That's what bureaucrats do.
Your background that led you to be a bureaucrat in the first place.
Yeah, what's your background that brought you to being what you're calling a bureaucrat?
Yeah, well, I am. I work for a government, isn't that? Okay, so I grew up in Pittsburgh, and a very fast history of Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was the steel capital of the world, had a huge boom. It was the mighty muscle of American economy, or at least we think it was. And in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and really accelerating in the 80s, all that production went somewhere else. And so Pittsburgh's population got cut in half. It cratered. The entire industry was gone. And that's when I grew up, right? So I grew up in this place that had this very proud heritage of making things for the rest of the world to grow. And all of a sudden, you looked around and half of us were gone. And so I wanted to try to solve that. I wanted to try to work on that. And so for 10 years in Pittsburgh, I was really fortunate enough to work for one of the, in my opinion, one of the most innovative community development corporations in the world, to combine things like affordable housing with new infrastructure developments, with new mixed-use development, with transit-oriented development, all this cool stuff Oregon was probably doing 15 years before them. And I loved it. It really got me super excited. And then I fell in love with a woman I met when we were in professional a cappella groups. No, it's a true story. And so I'm very comfortable with a mic in my hand. And she said, I can't find the right job in Pittsburgh. It was the recession, so we moved to Vermont. And I did that same kind of job, but in a place that everyone wanted to be. It was an economy that was very stable, and that had no downturn, right? And it was total opposite from where I had learned to do what I know how to do. And then I was tired of meetings till midnight with bad cookies and people throwing stuff at me. So I said I needed a break, and my wife had grown up on the West Coast, and her family now had moved to Portland, and so I said, let's move to Portland, which we did without jobs. And I said I need a break, and a big gap in my skill set is understanding how big sums of money fuel our economy. And so I wanted to find a job that taught me how to do that. And because I had this like 15-year career of immersing myself in community, I said, well, how the heck am I going to get to learn Oregon fast? So I combined those two things, and I hoodwinked the state into giving me a job running different investment funds. And so that's how I got here. Yeah.
Nate, thanks for being here. And I have this, let's give Nate a round of applause. And on behalf of EDCO, every keynote speaker gets this tankard. And apparently, well, it seems that if you bring that to any PubTalk in the future, you can get it filled. That's the thing, yeah.
Seems excessive.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Appreciate it.